My name is Sean Clemmensen with Tiago Title. I started Tiago Title, I guess it was 3.5 years ago now, in our 4th year. By trade, I was a real estate lawyer, still am. That's where I dealt with seller's disclosures, the property code, the violations, represented buyers, sellers, real estate agents, all of them, you name it. So that's where my experience comes from. We got in the title world 3.5, 4 years ago. So I'm going to talk about seller's disclosures. The way I like to do these, got about 50 minutes. I don't want to spend the whole time talking about seller's disclosures. I'd rather finish in 30 and then allow you guys time to ask questions, because there are a lot of topics that come up, a lot of questions come up with seller's disclosures, so I want to be sure we address that. So property condition, as you guys can imagine, is pretty hotly contested. It's obviously very important. You have the sellers typically want to convey as is. Buyers want to know every single thing when it pertains to the property. So in going through the seller's disclosures, you got to keep those two frames of mind. Keep that in your mind. Think about who you represent the most. If a lot of you guys have buyers, think about that. If you've got sellers, think about that. And I'll present both different sides to you so that you can understand why we're going over some of the things that we're going over. So disclosure in residential transactions. What form, does everybody in here use the Metrotex form, the TREC form, the TAR form? Who? Metrotex? TREC? Okay. There are 3 different forms mainly. The TREC form is the most basic. So TREC's seller's disclosure form strictly tracks the property language of the the language of the Texas property code. You've got TAR's form. TAR's a little bit more in depth. What they do, the Texas Association of Realtors, they constantly pay attention, look at different cases that have come out. You've got the broker lawyer committee that's got 6 lawyers on there. It's got 6 brokers. It's got a publicly appointed official. So they're constantly paying attention to what's going on in our business, in the title insurance world, property code, real estate agents. So TAR is constantly updating their form. So you may not notice it, but you might see an additional question, or 2 years in you'll see just a random question that gets added to the Texas Association of Realtors form. That's in more depth. The most in-depth seller's disclosure form is the Metrotex form. So if you're a seller, most of the time people want to do the TREC form because don't have to disclose as much. It's a lot less legwork. Buyers obviously want the Metrotex form to be used because you obtain a lot more information. I mean, it's not the TREC form's 3 pages. I think Metrotex's is 8 or 9 now, something around there. So it's far more in depth. It's got to be given on or before the effective date of the contract. Just remember that. Now, yes, you can agree. You can put a different date in there under the contract about the date for delivery. But by and large, it's got to be given on or before the effective date of the contract. I always suggest whenever somebody submits an offer to your client, if you've got the listing and somebody submits an offer to your client, if you accept it, just shoot the seller's disclosure right back. It's just much easier to give it before, even if you agree to 3 days after the contract is executed. If you've got it ready, go ahead and get it out. Allow the buyer time to inspect it, look at it, read it, and address any issues that are on there. So again, I would always, as a matter of practice, do it on or before. I understand sometimes your sellers don't give you everything that you need, or you don't get all the questions answered, and it's okay to do it as long as it's within the time frame. So if it's 3 days that you've agreed to, make sure you get that within the 3 days. Again, I just briefly touched about this, but this is the Texas Property Code section, in case anybody ever asks you about this, where the seller's disclosure is required. I'm not going to read through it, but it does apply to single-family homes, townhomes, and condos. Single-family, townhomes, and condos. What you don't see on there are duplexes. Keep that in mind. Does not mention duplex at all in the statute. It just mentions 1 to 4 family, which is single family, townhomes, and condos. The purpose of the disclosure: make clear what appliances, equipment, and features exist on the property to the best of your knowledge. Remember, all of this, when a seller's providing a seller's disclosure, has to be provided if they have the knowledge. It's not, could I guess if I had a claim, or do I think there's an issue with any foundation? That's not what's required when you complete a seller's disclosure. You actually have to have the knowledge. Whether or not these, sorry, I'm technologically deficient. You've got whether or not these items are in working condition, whether the seller knows of any defects, certain conditions like termite treatment, previous fires, floodings, claims, any roof claims have been made. You're going to see a whole host of those now. Obviously, we've had some pretty crazy storms lately, so roof claims are being made. Keep that in mind when you turn around and you list a property in 6 months. There is, especially the MetroTex form, that does mention, have there been any prior roof claims or any claims at all, any insurance claims? If the answer is yes, then you do have to disclose that. And I know what I'm saying may be very basic, but you'd be surprised about the amount of cases I've litigated before where it's the most basic thing that results in a lawsuit. The thing that seems the most simple is oftentimes what gets people in the most trouble. Another thing that need for repairs, if you have to disclose that, this is one I want to point out that oftentimes I feel like gets overlooked when a seller's disclosure is provided. Unpaid HOA fees, violations of deed restrictions. What's an example of that? Let's say that it's a 2-story home and the seller knows that the deed restriction said it has to be a 1-story home. That's a violation of a deed restriction. That means it has to be disclosed on the seller's disclosure. And this is the one I see of all seller's disclosures. I call them infractions, violations, mistakes, whatever you want to call them. This is the one I see happen the most often, unpaid HOA fees. I can't tell you how often we pull title and there's an HOA lien on a property, which obviously means fees have not been paid, and I'll go back and just, because I'm curious, check the contract and see in the seller's disclosure and see if that was disclosed. 9 times out of 10, it's not disclosed. And I can tell you, I know the sellers may say, well, I didn't know that I didn't pay my HOA dues, or I didn't know that there were HOAs that were required. Yes, they did. They always know, because you get countless number of letters from collection agencies and the HOAs stating that you've not paid this. So this is one, if your seller tells you, yeah, I think I'm a little behind on my HOA dues. If they tell you that, make sure you include that in the seller's disclosure or when your seller fills out that seller's disclosure. Lawsuits, pending lawsuits. If your seller, let's say, didn't pay their credit card bill, they know they didn't pay their credit card bill. They go out, it gets litigated, goes to court, an abstract of judgment is filed on that property. That's a lawsuit. Obviously, it went to court. There's a lawsuit there. If that seller knows about that, which most of the time they do, then that also should be included on the seller's disclosure if it's pertaining to that property. It's almost always they're going to attach it to the property. I would disclose that. And you're going to hear me say this over and over and over again about seller's disclosures. Disclose, disclose, disclose. There's no harm, in my opinion, in over-disclosing, especially when it can prevent a very costly and expensive lawsuit. And any conditions that materially affect the health or safety of an individual. That's very broad and vague. Examples could be if something's, maybe let's say there's a rafter in the house or a beam in the house that you know is loose. You know it's on its last leg. That to me arguably would be materially affect the health or safety of an individual if that fell. If you know that there's some mold in the house, arguably that affects the health or safety of an individual. Most courts would say it does. So things like that are very important to consider when you're completing a seller's disclosure. Any and everything that you want to know everything that you can about that piece of property from your client. Again, I've mentioned this before, but it's knowledge. It's got to be completed to the best of the seller's belief and knowledge as of the date the notice is completed and signed by the seller. Doesn't mean should have known or may knew or suspected. It means they did know. They knew that there was mold in that house. Not that their neighbor's house has mold and maybe theirs does. They knew that the foundation was defective, not that the neighbor has defective foundation and maybe their property does. That's not going to suffice. It's got to be knowledge. So whatever they know at the time that seller's disclosure is completed has to be included. And I'll address one of the questions I get all the time, which is, should you amend a seller's disclosure? I'm going to give you a couple cases and examples about when you should amend the seller's disclosure. I'm already running close on my time. So I'm going to just sum this up. Top 10 things I feel like, in my opinion, you should know about seller's disclosure. If you're going to take anything from today, just remember these top 10 things, in my opinion. And if anybody ever wants a copy of this PDF. I'll have cards and you can just ask and I'll send you the PDF. Number one, we already went through this, the form to use. I would encourage you, if you're members of Metrotex, to use the Metrotex form. It's thorough, it covers pretty much everything. If your seller completes that and they do it with knowledge, most of the time they're going to be okay. Again, the TREC form is in its basic, it's the most basic of all forms. Again, when you first all came in here, I said, think about if you're representing the buyer or the seller. You know, if you want to disclose less, it's perfectly acceptable to use the TREC form. Perfectly acceptable. It's a 3-page TREC form. Yes, TREC's is 3, TAR's is 5, and I think Metrotex's is 8 or 9. I think it's right around there. So again, TREC's is the basic. If you have the seller and they don't want to divulge as much, then you can use the TREC form, and that's perfectly acceptable. There are a couple exemptions to this obligation under the Texas Property Code, Section 5. I'm not going to go over all of them, but the ones you're going to see most often are a builder of a new home does not have to complete a seller's disclosure because presumably they built it correctly and there are no issues. Again, that's why I say, presuming they've done it that way. Now, I have had situations where an agent will call me. I've got a builder that, admitted over the phone that he knew the foundation was incorrect, or there was something wrong with the foundation, the slab was leaking, or whatever. Where a builder admitted that, I can't imagine why they would do that, but they did. In that situation, if a builder actually knows if there's a defective foundation, that builder should provide a seller's disclosure or some sort of notice that that foundation is defective. Probably not going to get that from them, but it is not required for a builder of a new home. A lot of builders do provide a seller's disclosure. It's in its form. It doesn't track any of these other forms, TREC, TAR, Metrotex. They're basically just disclosing any and all conditions with the property. They say most of them are obviously perfect, but they do provide some sort of disclosure notice. A trustee or an executor of the estate. You're going to see this one a lot. I know there are some investors in here as well. I know investors work a lot with estates and trustees and buying properties out of an estate. Seller's disclosure does not have to be provided. Why? Well, if the deceased person was the person that lived in the property, then they're the only ones that could have knowledge about the property condition. The trustee, if it's the sister, and she never lived there and she lives in New Hampshire, she likely has no knowledge about the condition of the property at all and can't speak to that. Now, you get into some unique cases where there have been cases about this where you have a trustee of an estate that happened to be, a sister that lived in the property with the deceased. In that situation, yes, I would argue that a seller's disclosure a notice has to be provided. But that's in their capacity as somebody that lived in the property, not in their capacity as a trustee of the estate. It's you're probably never going to encounter that, but it does come up. Lender, after foreclosing on a property, same rationale applies there. The lenders that go in and foreclose on these properties, they likely have never stepped foot in that piece of property. So they have no idea what the property looks like. If any of you have ever been in here in a property after a foreclosure, most of the time it's not a pretty sight. But lenders do not have to provide seller's disclosures. Some foreclosing lenders do. I can name 2 that we worked with that do provide them. They don't have to, they just do it anyway because they want to be overly thorough, they want to communicate, they want to be transparent, but most lenders will not.
I've got a question.
Yes, sir.
If I were to buy a property on the courthouse steps, so I'm not the lender, and I just changed the locks. I never did any work on the property, but I wanted to sell it as is to, presumptuously your neighbor. So would I have to provide a seller's disclosure? I haven't done any work. I've turned on the electricity. I've changed the locks. So.
Good question, Roddy. He asked, if anybody else couldn't hear, he asked if he acquires a property on the courthouse steps, after the lender forecloses, he then owns the property, and then he turns around and sells it. I would say yes, you have to provide a seller's disclosure. You may never have lived there, never stepped in the property, never rehabbed it at all, but you are the owner of the property. You are the seller of the property. You just have to complete the seller's disclosure to the best of your knowledge. Now, you may not know anything about the property, and as you guys know, on the seller's disclosures notice, there is a place to put, I don't know. And it's okay to not know. You're not tasked with going to the property and finding out. You just have to disclose what you know at the time. So, yes, great question. It needs to be provided. Again, if you don't know, it's okay to say that you don't know. If you know any material defects, then that has to be disclosed anytime. That's going to be covered on the seller's disclosure, but a material defect always needs to be disclosed. A material defect is defined by courts as a specific issue with a system or component of a residential property that may have a significant adverse impact on the value of the property or that poses an unreasonable risk to people. That's a material defect. Does anybody have any questions about what would qualify as a material defect? Okay, if you think about it, you can ask me at the end. Here's an example I provided. A lender who knows about a cracked foundation in a property that the lender acquired through a foreclosure must disclose that known defect, if they know about it. If they don't know about it, then obviously, again, I keep hashing this out, but they don't have to disclose that if they don't know about it. But if they do, they better disclose it. The seller's disclosure is not required on a duplex. Again, that's the law, but in my opinion, you should always provide it. I would always provide one for each side of the duplex. I can't imagine any reason why you would not. Yes, sir?
I do a inspection of the property by an inspector, and I tell the bank that these things are wrong. Now, do they have to tell the next person that this inspector found all these defects?
Yes, because then they have knowledge. So if they're material defects, so if okay, sorry. So his question was, he goes out and does an inspection on a property, gets an inspection report, sends it to the lender that foreclosed. The lender then have to disclose that to the new buyer. My response was, well, it has to be a material defect. The question is then, what's a material defect? A specific issue with the system or component of the property that may have a significant adverse impact. So are a couple shingles on the roof, is that going to be a material defect? Unlikely. Is a cracked foundation going to be a material defect? You bet. So it depends on what's in that inspection report. If it's all cosmetic and there's no, again, material defect, and you can imagine why cases come about because of this all the time, because we don't really know what a material defect is. The way we know is we continue to look at cases. We look at how courts have defined material defects. Although I can tell you, a court down in Hidalgo County is going to define a material defect different than a court in Collin County.
Especially if you go to court.
Especially, exactly. I mean, that's the way it is. I mean, it's in all of our jurisdictions. I mean, they're different. So some may define a material defect as, cracked foundation, things like that. Some may say, well, you had 20 missing shingles on that roof. That could lead to water coming in. Somebody could slip and fall. That's a material defect. Some courts may say that. It's unlikely, but most it's going to have to be something that causes risk to the value of the property or causes risk to people. So if it is in that inspection report, that's a great question. You do need to, the lender does need to provide that if it's a material defect. The cosmetic, no. I mean, somebody smears stuff on the wall, which was what happens often in foreclosures. No, nothing like that. Did somebody else have a question?
Well, I was just going to say that with my clients, I flat out tell them, if you have any question, you put it on there, and if you don't want to go to jail, you put it on there. Mm-hmm. And I'll tell you, you'd be amazed what kinds of things get put on there all of a sudden that they didn't know. When you tell them, they might end up in jail if they don't put it.
Well, and that raises a good point. I'll talk about the remedies under some of these, what happens if you do not provide an open and honest seller's disclosure. I mean, you have the DTPA, which is the Deceptive Trade Practices Act. You have common law fraud. I mean, you have an array of remedies for an aggrieved party to pursue, which is exactly why I always say disclose, 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 because you prevent that. And I can tell you the Deceptive Trade Practices Act, if you go to court and you lose, the buyer could get treble damages against you, which means if it was a $50,000 issue, it now becomes $150,000. So it's the snake that bites you in our litigation world is the DTPA.
And
so, yeah. So that was again. I'm going to talk about inspection reports as well. Duplex, I would provide one. Just again, disclose, disclose, disclose. Lease does not apply to leases. Before anybody asks me, does it apply to lease purchases? Does it apply to lease options? You're still leasing, so no, it does not. Now, once you acquire the property and you turn around and sell it, of course. But a lease purchase, a lease option, it's exactly that. It's a lease. A death, shockingly, this is the first time this happened to me in 3 months and all of the thousands of clearance transactions we closed. We had one where the seller's agent called me and said that there was a murder in the house. It was a very high profile one. And that has to be disclosed. A murder has to be disclosed. Please remember that. Now, a natural cause, somebody dies from a heart attack, suicide, an accident unrelated to the condition of the property, does not have to be disclosed. So somebody spills some water, slips and falls on the water, they die, that does not have to be disclosed. The slab is leaking, it comes up through underneath the wood floor, the whole wood floor is wet, somebody slips and falls and dies, that has to be disclosed. Because that relates to the condition of the property. Somebody spilling water? No. Again, known murders, please disclose those. This Texas statute also requires disclosure of deaths that were caused by a condition existing on the property, even if the condition was subsequently remedied. Yes, sir.
20 years back.
How long ago was what?
How long is that? Before that was 3 years.
You mean if you know that the death was like 10 years ago? Yeah, I would still disclose it. If you know it, then you need to disclose it, even if it's a murder, especially the murder. There's no reason to not disclose it, because if that comes out, which most of the time it will, any murder like this, the case I was talking about that was high profile, all somebody would have to do is Google the name or Google the address, and all comes up. So a known murder, if they knew, yes. Let's see. And I do get asked this question, so I'm going to address it anyway, even though it's kind of a sensitive subject. But people do ask me, probably once a month I get a phone call, if somebody dies in the house related to AIDS, does that have to be disclosed? That does not have to be disclosed. Okay? Just so we're all clear, get that out of the way. It does not have to be disclosed. Inspection reports. This is something that comes up all the time. Seller and broker have a duty to disclose any known material defects. Possession of a prior inspection report may be evidence of the seller's or broker's knowledge of a known defect. Courts are all over the board on this, all over the place. You'll have a court in Dallas that says a prior inspection report does not have to be disclosed. You have a court in Hidalgo or McAllen or Lubbock that says it has to be disclosed. They literally, it's split 50-50 on whether to disclose a prior inspection report. Stated that right there. Now, if it's a known defect, if you get an inspection report and there's a known defect in there and it's not remedied, then it needs to be disclosed. Then you come into the issue, do you have to disclose the inspection report? I would argue that you do. I'm going to show you another slide here in a minute. But anything that, if it's a known defect, if you get an inspection report from the buyer's agent and they send it to you and you don't even open the email, courts they will presume that the recipient of the email read it. Please remember that. If it is sent and you get it, they will presume that you are tasked with the knowledge of its contents. That's,
Even if you reply, I'm not opening it.
even, yeah, and the whole I'm not opening it, you know, I hear that a lot. Yeah, that doesn't do anything. People will say, yeah, I'm not opening your inspection report. It doesn't matter, you got it, and you are presumed to have, you're tasked with the knowledge of its contents. I can't stress that enough because I do get that question all the time. Well, I wrote back and said, you know, I reject your email. No, it's not going to work. Again, most courts are going to say you had knowledge of its contents. So at that point, if they're going to make that presumption, then you might as well read it. And you might as well, if there are issues to be repaired, repair them, or give the inspection report. If you can keep it, give the inspection report to the new buyer. TAR seller's disclosure notice. Some of you in here probably were already getting ahead and thought that the seller to list and attach copies of the previous inspection reports performed in the last 4 years. TAR's form asks for that. So if there's an inspection report and you have it, and it's within the last 4 years, TAR's, quote, recommendation is to disclose it.
But doesn't it say in the last 4 years that you have performed or that you have ordered? I think it specifies the word you. So that's the gray area, in my opinion, is I didn't order this. So therefore, do I have to put it? Because some Yahoo inspector or some, they get their brother-in-law to do, and I'm like, I'm not going to disclose that to the world that they got their plumber and said, this thing is about to fall in. So I'm torn between being legally bound to report that to a future buyer when I've got another report that retracts or defends that there's not.
Shit. You're fine. Roddy is playing lawyer, and I love that. And that's what we do. We will pin something on a word like you received or you ordered it. I completely agree with you. For the most part, that's not a position I would take. It depends on, look, at the end of the day, it's how, do you want to disclose it, or do you want to, what would it look like, for me, in my opinion, what would it look like if this went to court?
Right. I understand. In front of a judge and jury, how would it look? Right.
His distinction is right. There is that fine distinction in there, and I agree with that. But then you have legally what might be the case, and then you have practically. So like if you go to court and the judge says, are you really going to hang your hat, Mr. Clemmensen, on that word you? And then he's going to say, come on, that's ridiculous. And then I'm going to say, no, it's not. It's the word. That's how it's defined. But the point is, do we really want to go that far? So again, I would, if you've received a copy of it, now the buyer's agent, what happens a lot, they may say, I've got this inspection report, I'll send you an amendment with the repairs I want, and you never get a copy of the inspection report. That's great. You don't have to disclose it. Right. There's no inspection report. They may have sent you an amendment, but that doesn't mean anything. So the inspection report, if you get a copy, usually the best thing to do is to disclose it. Now, if any of you guys ever want to come up with creative arguments for not disclosing it, you just need to call me on my cell phone and we'll chat about it. But by and large, I would disclose these inspection reports.
So on the record? Off the record,
yeah, we'll chat about it later.
Justin, in a situation where, let's assume that you have a buyer and a seller, the buyer bought the house, everything's closed, cleared, lender approved, everything's done. They live in the house for 2 years, and everything obviously that a lender or anybody wanted to take care of was taken care of according to whatever inspection reports were done for that buyer. And in 2 years he decides to sell. That's obviously within a 4-year parameter. Does the fact that that sale closed, was transacted, finished, completed, whatever, negate whatever happened before he purchased it, closed it? Or because most of those buyers are not going to have that report sitting around. It's going to be trashed or lost.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's coming up on the next slide. It's a great question right here. What really takes care of that, her question was, let's say they get the inspection report, they go in and they make the repairs and they fix it. If you repair the defect, if you remedy the defect, you do not have to disclose it. Okay, so if you take care of all the repairs that are outlined in that inspection report, you do not have to disclose it. Oh, I don't know, I keep pressing the wrong one. Because again, if you repair it, it's no longer defective. So you do not have to disclose it. And it's, remember, we're going back to the material defects. We're not talking about, somebody wanted the hole in the wall patched. That's not a material defect. Yes, ma'am.
Done by a professional, licensed, or whatever, or like he was saying,
I wish I could say that there is a standard, although I've seen do what? Oh, I'm sorry. The question was, is there a standard for inspection reports? Do you have to be licensed, or can, Joe Schmo, the brother, do that? If Joe Schmo, the brother, is an inspector, then they can do the inspection report.
What if he's not? I'm thinking.
If he just randomly was never inspected the property, had no qualifications at all, I would argue that inspection report's not an inspection report and get it, basically deemed void on its face. But that's again a question that would be on a case-by-case basis. It's hard to tell, you know, it's a matter of, when we're talking about the law, what really qualifies as an inspection report. You know, if it was so-and-so's brother that's never done an inspection at all before in their life, that to me is not an inspection report, and I could get that thrown out fairly easily. So again, repairs, remedy defects. So if you make the repairs, then you're okay. You don't have to disclose that. We've addressed this already. I didn't open the email. It's a great point though, because it happens all the time. Commercial transactions. TAR has a commercial property condition statement. It's optional. It is not required in commercial transactions. Although I've never closed on a commercial deal and known the two parties not to require the buyer or the seller to give a disclosure of some sort. Most commercial transactions, most buyers and sellers in commercial transactions are going to have those on file. So it's optional, but most of the time on any commercial transaction, you're going to see that the condition form, at least TAR's form, is provided. Oops, I kept going back. I keep pressing the wrong button on here. It's much broader in scope. You start talking with any other issues that you normally see on a commercial transaction: wetlands, underground storage tanks, toxic waste. Any and everything that you don't usually consider on a residential property. They're far more complex. If anybody's got any questions about commercial disclosures, we can chat about it. More than happy to talk about all of those. Relo companies, I get this question fairly often too. Does a relocation company have to provide a seller's disclosure? If the relocation company is the seller, it has to prepare the seller's disclosure notice and give it. Most of them act in the role as the asset manager. You get the nice thick package from the relo company. If they're representing the seller, usually the relo company is going to put in a seller's disclosure. In fact, I don't think I've ever seen a relo company not put one in, but they don't have to if they're not the seller. If they're just acting as an asset manager, they're not required to provide the inspection report. Some more commonly asked questions. Does the seller disclosure create any representation or warranties by the seller? In other words, does it warrant that they're going to make the repairs? Does it warrant any? No, it does not. It's not a warranty, meaning you cannot go sue them for breach of warranty. You cannot sue a seller if something comes up for a breach of warranty, which is a specific type of cause of action. Now, there are other forms of causes of action which we're going to go through. If the notice is not timely delivered and is given less than 6 days before closing, does the buyer have the right to rescind or delay the transaction? They can terminate before closing. I don't recall ever seeing one where somebody terminated for a seller's disclosure not being provided, but they do have that remedy. You can elect to terminate at any time before closing. After closing, no. Cannot rescind a transaction after closing. 7-day notice period. There's a 7-day notice period in the TREC contract. You can waive that period. What that basically means is if your seller's disclosure, if you don't get it on or before, let's say you agree to 3 days, you don't get it in 3 days, and then closing comes and goes. If the buyer does not get it, they go in and they sign. They can't go back and somehow, they implicitly waive this 7-day period that they have to, objection requirement right here to timely receive the notice. You guys probably are not ever going to see this. Most of the time you'll get the seller's disclosure. If you don't, just know that the buyer can terminate before closing if they do not get the seller's disclosure.
So Sean, I've got a question there. Instead of giving an option period in the promulgated contract, I usually will use that 7-day period, that I have 7 days once I receive the seller's disclosure. Mm-hmm. In lieu of having, what is it, paragraph 24, yeah, page 8, 23 or 24. So what is, it says timely receive the notice, so do I need to sign it? Because if I was making an offer to buy your house and you hadn't filled out the seller's disclosure, I hand you a copy of it, and then I say, hey, you have within 7 days to get this back to me, right?
Sure, that's right.
Really, I have 14, because if it took you 7 days to get it to me, then I have an additional 7 days, correct?
From there, yeah. So after that 7 days,
I use that as my option period, so to speak.
It's clever, I like that.
In a roundabout way, because you could give it to me tomorrow, but I still have 7 days.
Yeah, you do.
But do I have to sign it? Or does it continue until you just sent it to, you faxed it to me, you emailed?
As long as there's proof.
Okay.
We talked to the TREC attorneys about that about 6 months ago, because we use that technique as well, pre-option period? And she said absolutely yes.
And it's a very clever technique. Now the one thing practically to consider in doing that is that most title companies, what's that? Oh, buttons. Those are mine? No. One thing to practically consider there is that when you start dealing with title companies and you're under contract, and let's say you have that, that's the reason if you want to back out of the contract, almost every title company is going to tell you, look, I need a signed release of earnest money by all parties before they release that earnest money. Now, with the option period, again, every title company is different. We can all manage ourselves differently. We will release the earnest money if we have proof that the option fee was timely delivered and if the notice was given within the allotted amount of days. If everybody's on board, we're not going to require release of earnest money signed by all parties. So that's, again, practically to consider there, because if you use that method that you guys are talking about, again, which is super creative and I like it, you may run the risk of getting earnest money tied up at the title company as opposed to just having a longer option period, and then if you terminate within time, the title company most of the time will just release it. And you don't face as much objection from a seller when you terminate from the option period than when you do the failure to provide the seller's disclosure notice and then the 7-day deadline.
Okay. Yeah. So I see where you're getting. I know you're trying to mitigate risk, right?
What?
As a title company, you're trying to mitigate your risk. Because then you don't want to get in the middle of me and the seller. I'm saying, hey, give me my earnest money. I terminated this contract. And per the contract, paragraph 7, seller's disclosure, it says I didn't get it, and you're like, I don't want to get in the middle of that.
Yeah. You
need to get me a signed release of earnest money, and then you'll get it. Is that your stance?
That's right, and the reason I say that is because I don't want to, I can't, every title company can do it different, but I can tell you by and large, most title companies are going to, if it's within the option, a lot of them still even require you to have the signed release of earnest money. We're not, I don't run my company that way. We're much more flexible when it comes to releases of earnest money and things like that. But if you're at another title company, if you're at a title company that you don't know what their policy is, then you are going to run that risk. That's again why it's important to know the policies of your title company. Any title company you deal with, you should know how they treat option fees, how they treat the seller's disclosure termination, how they treat earnest money. You need to know all those questions because, like Roddy's mentioning, it may change strategy. If he knows he might be going to a title company that he can't control, then he may go over to the option fee as opposed to the seller's disclosure termination notice. So it's all strategy, just knowing, and you need to be sure, if you've never asked your title company what their policies are about release of earnest money, shoot them an email and just ask them.
A couple of times, we sent in the contract, and then I had the seller's disclosure 7 days. They turn around and execute it, and turn around and send the seller's disclosure right then in execution, so that it gets wiped out. But
yeah.
it does work.
It does. Let's see, we talked about that. I want to touch on some of these cases, just frankly because I think they're funny and I like them. Yes, ma'am.
Before we get to that, Justin, what if you have, when you work with two companies, what if you have mandated repairs by the lender? Seller says no, I'm not going to do it. So you know that you're kind of
The question is, if you have lender mandated repairs and the seller doesn't want to do them, my position is, and the law supports it, is that a seller is not required to make repairs. Regardless of what the lender says, a seller does not have to make the repairs, which means they can say no, and hey, if the buyer doesn't close on their house, that's the risk they take. But again, and the law supports it, like I said, that there's no requirement that a seller makes repairs just because the lender's guidelines suggest that they have to be repaired. That's a lender issue. That's not a seller issue.
Okay, and this is the second part to that. If it is a VA loan, and they cannot move forward because VA will not work with it, the seller is saying, hey, I'm not terminating, the buyer is saying, I'm not terminating, because they're arguing over.
So the question was, if it's a VA loan, buyer says they're not terminating, seller says they're not terminating because they're arguing over the earnest money. What happens then is we get into the class on earnest money disputes, but the short version is that if the seller is not going to agree to the release of the earnest money, and the buyer's not signing the release either, then that property, the seller is subject to an earnest money dispute. If the seller is subject to an earnest money dispute, arguably they cannot go sell their house. Because there could potentially be a cloud on title because there's an active dispute in the litigation, and there's no termination of that contract. There's no release of the obligations under the contract. Now, you get into, it's a little bit different if the buyer sends in a termination and then, they sign a release, then you start getting into whether or not the seller can, are they still under contract, are they not? Some lawyers in courts will say they are, some will say they're not. So it's really it's one of the hotly litigated cases in real estate, is earnest money disputes. But the safe assumption is that if no party's been released, the seller says, I'm not making the VA repairs. No parties have released each other from their obligations under the contract. The seller can market the property, but the minute that seller goes under contract with somebody else, they probably should release that earnest money back to the other buyer, because if the buyer has a savvy investor, and I've seen this happen I see this happen all the time. If the buyer has a savvy investor, or the buyer is a savvy investor, or if the buyer has a savvy buyer's agent that's just flagging that property, and the minute it goes under MLS and it's back under contract, they'll turn around and shoot an email right over to the sellers, hey, you can't go under contract, you better release this earnest money to my buyer right away or you're going to be in a whole host of trouble. And that's a good strategy and a good argument to make. Noteworthy cases, again, repairs correct defects, not prove continued existence. This is one that does come up. 3 or 4 neighbors say, my roof is damaged, so John Smith thinks his roof is damaged. Hasn't had anybody look at it, but he thinks his is damaged because all his neighbors' roofs are damaged. No, that's not going to suffice. Common knowledge of a neighborhood condition does not establish actual knowledge. Now, if the seller had a roofer come out and the roofer said, yeah, your roof is damaged, or you've got damaged foundation, then yeah. But just suspecting that you might have an issue because neighbors do, that does not constitute knowledge, and you don't have to disclose it. Seller answered, here's another one. Oh, so I love this one. Seller answered no to questions related to improper damage, and then told the buyer he actually knew. Yeah, not a good idea, okay? Don't in writing say no, and then when you're on the phone with the buyer, tell them over the phone, hey, listen, I just want to give you the heads up, I was lying, okay? Do what you with it, but I was lying to you on that seller's disclosure. Don't do that, because then you're going to end up in court like Mr. Kessler and Fanning, and that's not good. You can imagine that seller lost. Oh, and my personal favorite of all seller's disclosure cases, Robbins versus Capozzi. It was in Tyler Court of Appeals. The buyer received notice that the garage was in working condition and had no known defects. After closing, the buyer had a car. No, the buyer had a truck. The seller had a small compact car. Well, the buyer tried to pull their truck into the garage and it didn't fit, and they sued the seller for lying on the seller's disclosure because they said they couldn't fit their truck in the garage. That's not going to count, okay? I mean, just because one has a Mini Cooper and the other one has a dually, hey, that's not an issue. That doesn't mean that the garage is defective like that buyer was making the argument. I love that one. Ongoing duty to disclose. Seller's disclosures do not per se impose an ongoing duty to disclose. I would encourage you to disclose if something comes up. And it's been coming up lately where you have roof claims and you've had a lot of these storms and these issues that have been coming up, and the listing agent will call me, they'll make a roof claim. Everyone, the buyer, everything's good, the buyer agent, they know there's a roof claim, they want it to get paid. I would argue that you need to go back, and I do tell seller's agents to go back and amend the seller's disclosure to state that you have knowledge that there's a roof claim. Why not? What's it hurt? That way, if it ever went to court, you showed the willingness as the seller to amend your disclosure. It is really hard for a seller to lose on a case like that when they are making a good faith attempt to constantly change things, update the forms. Yes, sir?
What's the correct way to change that seller's disclosure? Just redo it, or just add a note to it?
You could take the original one that you had, and then you could change it, and then everybody initials, and then you could just date it like if you just date next to your initial, if you want to do that. Some people will just completely redo the seller's disclosure. I don't like that approach as much because I like the fact that there's a document, there's one document where it's documented that everything took place. That way you can still argue that the original one was in place, they weren't supplementing the other one with this one. So I just advocate making the change, handwriting it in there, changing the whatever it is, dating it, and everybody initials, and then obviously sign the last page. Broker liability. If you're a real estate broker in here, please pay attention. Not that you guys aren't paying attention, but please now. If you're a broker in here, normally there's no cause of action against you if a seller violates any of the rules. You're not going to get held liable as the seller's broker. Now, if you know that that seller lied, then you are going to be, you will lose your license. You could be drug into a lawsuit. You could get DTPA against you, which is not fun. And again, I only write this in here because everything that you've seen in here is from my experience. I mean, I've had a listing agent call me and say, hey, I know the seller fibbed a little bit on this seller's disclosure. And I said, well, you need to go amend that right now. And you need to get that back out. You need to tell the seller to do it. And if the seller doesn't do it, you need to fire your client. Because no commission is worth you losing your license. Not something you've worked so incredibly hard for. Not worth it at all. So if you know that, if you know they lie, you either need to say, hey, look, you told me that there was this possibility for damage, or you told me there was damage. Why did you fill out this seller's disclosure this way? Oh, well, I don't want to disclose it. Pfft, you're fired. It's just not worth going down that road. I've mentioned the DTPA throughout this, throughout this whole hour now. It's the Deceptive Trade Practices Act. It applies to real estate transactions. Real estate is a good within the meaning of the Deceptive Trade Practices Act. Now, if you fail to disclose a material item and your actions as a seller are deemed unconscionable, which courts vary on that definition, but treble damages, attorney's fees, and court costs are all imposed. Meaning if both sides have an attorney, you're paying for all of the attorney's fees, which makes a $25,000 case a $100,000 case just in an instant. So that's why this is the one I was telling you, that's the snake that can bite you. It's this one, the DTPA. So that's why you always need to disclose. You know, always, if you have knowledge, disclose that. DTPA can hurt you. This is the actual cause of action for a DTPA claim. Seller or agent failed to disclose information concerning the property. It was known at the time of the transaction. Seller or agent intended to induce the buyer into the transaction withholding information. In other words, I knew as a seller if I disclosed that there was structural and a foundation issue, the buyer wouldn't buy the property. That's these last two elements right here. If you're a seller and you've done those, you will lose. Statutory fraud is also another cause of action under the Texas Business and Commerce Code. Misrepresentation, if you make any misrepresentation. What that basically is the concealment or disclosure of a non-material fact, or non-disclosure, I should say. So if you know a fact that the foundation is defective and you don't disclose it, that's a misrepresentation because you did not disclose the fact that you knew. So you can be held liable, or your seller can be held liable for statutory fraud. Common law fraud, another one. To kind of get where I'm going with this, there's so many remedies for an aggrieved party. Common law fraud, the existence of statutory fraud does not preclude a buyer from filing suit on the grounds of common law fraud as well. In other words, they can all exist side by side in a lawsuit. Yes, sir.
Okay, on this disclosure, the buyer discovers the problem, say 5 months later, 4 months later, after they get to the house. How much time do they still have before they can file a claim?
That depends on which cause of action they file it under, but you could just say, I would just rely on 2 years. So 2 years is really one of the limitations times. But again, it's not from the time it closed. It's from the time that they possibly, you get into debates about whether or not, when does the statute of limitations run? And the statute of limitations, for everybody that doesn't know, is for breach of contract, 4 years. In other words, if somebody breached a contract with you and you were injured, you have 4 years to sue them. Otherwise, the other non-aggrieved party can assert that as a defense in a cause of action or a case. So DTPA is 2. Now, if you have knowledge of it, that it was like 4 years later, I mean, practically speaking, you're going to have such a tough time winning a case like that anyway. Because, you know, unless you can prove that that seller had actual knowledge 4 years ago, it's going to be hard to win, which brings me to another point about seller's disclosures is practically what's the likelihood of winning a case? You know, how you're going to win a case if you're, because again, this happens all the time where a buyer will get upset. They buy a property, they suspect that the seller knew about a defective foundation, they knew about some sort of issue with the property. They're just adamant, they call me, I want to sue the seller, I'm going to win. My first question is, how are you going to prove that they had knowledge? What do you know right now? What do you know that the seller had? Well, I don't know anything, I'm just suspecting. Well, was it an issue in a prior inspection report? No. So those are the questions an attorney is going to ask you is, what proof do we have that the seller actually had knowledge at the time that seller's foreclosure? In other words, the burden of proof in these types of claims, unfortunately for buyers, is pretty high. Now you can go through discovery, we can take depositions, we can do the written discovery, we can have hearings, we can go through all of that, and then we can go to trial, we can win, we can get money, but by that time you've spent out probably at least on a minimum. If you get us, you know, us attorneys, we have really big heads, so our fees are pretty high. Okay, we think highly of ourselves, so you're probably going to get charged at least $300 an hour. So to sue a case, to try that cause of action is going to be costly. So, you know, unless you've got something that you know that they knew about, or you catch wind, maybe they told a neighbor prior to closing, God, I know the foundation's bad, and you know, I know that the foundation's bad, but I'm not going to tell this guy buying my house. Well, then, that's enough evidence right there. But it's difficult, and not that they can't be done, but they are difficult to win because of you have to prove the knowledge element. As is transactions. I do want to, I know I'm like only got 5 minutes left, so anybody have any random questions about, we can talk about anything. I mean, seller's disclosures in particular. Yes, ma'am.
True case. We had a
Ooh, I like these.
And while during the rehab, the neighbor comes around the room, and she's very talkative and informs us.
Maybe one of those chatty Cathys? Nice.
Yeah, one of those. Okay. And informs us that there was an FBI drug raid on that house, our house. So I was the realtor, my investor. I said, no, you don't have to disclose it. She went and talked to another attorney. No, you don't have to disclose it. She's adamant she had to disclose it.
Well, did anybody die as part of the drug raid?
Not that I'm aware.
Okay. Was it a meth lab that could arguably attribute to the material condition of the property? Okay. What type of drugs are we talking about?
Cocaine.
Cocaine. The question was, I just randomly spouted out cocaine in front of a room on video. I'm so glad nobody can hear you and they heard me. The question was, she had they purchased at the foreclosure, right?
Correct.
After they closed, or they got the property at the foreclosure, bought it on the courthouse steps, a neighbor came over and said there was an FBI drug raid on the property. My question was, what type of drug was it? Cocaine is the answer. The reason I asked that is because if it was crystal meth, not that I'm knowledgeable about the makings of drugs, but if it was
allegedly
digging but crystal meth could arguably alter the property in such a condition that it makes it unhealthy or unsafe for a person. Arguably that would. You know, an FBI drug raid, I would say no. I mean, if nobody got injured as part of that, no. I mean, if it was, I'm gonna just be quiet before I dig myself in the deep.
So let me ask you, if the drug raid, let me take it a step further.
If it was
So
what?
on the cocaine drug raid, someone got shot,
Okay.
but didn't die at the property, they died on the way to the hospital. Do you have to disclose that?
I would argue
They got shot,
shot.
but they
got
were
shot.
not pronounced dead at the property.
if the actual shooting that was the contributing factor to the death occurred on the property, I would argue it has to be disclosed.
Wow. I've got to edit my, okay, that's...
Somebody else have a question on this side?
I had one woman who stands out who's a really good buyer, and I have one woman who's a really bad buyer. And the really good buyer, we saw one of these floors that rated high for whatever that was. And so I sent her an email and I said, hey, you might want to check the house. Fortunately, I knew she wasn't going to sue me, at least I didn't think she would, but I thought she would like to know about the high ratings on this laminated floor. And she did a test, and she sent me the test, and it's within the normal range. So my comment is now I would have never done that with the other woman who was a bad buyer.
Right.
My question to you is, would you have done it at all? Would you even brought the subject up to a past buyer?
If it tested in normal range?
No. I didn't know what the test was. We didn't know what the test was. We didn't know the issues with the floor at the time of installation.
Whether it was...
It's been 2 years. I just was, because I got along with the woman, I said, hey, you might want to have a test of your house. And she did have a test.
And it was all within normal range?
My comment is would you have even opened that door for that?
So would you have the agents even opened the door and said you should have a test of your floor? That's a tough one, because then you start talking about agency relationship and agency law, which is a whole different ballgame. But if you had reason to believe that there was something that could potentially injure that person, or if the floor level or the test would come back and it could potentially harm your client, then yes, it's probably a good thing that you did it. If it was just a suspicion, if you had no knowledge, then I would say no. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
If you have a situation where a person died, they did not find the body for 7, 8 days, bodily fluid drained out, they had to have a hazmat team come in, do you still disclose that?
How did they die? Just natural causes? Nope, doesn't have to be disclosed.
Even though a hazmat team
No, they just came in and cleaned up. It wasn't, the death was not a murder. It was caused by natural causes, or even if it was a suicide, it doesn't have to be disclosed. Now, if the hazmat team spilled some bad substance in the property that could contribute to the health of the individual buying it, then yes, that would have to be disclosed.
Same thing. One of the bad person house. I got reports from people around the neighborhood. Multiple people had died in the house. I didn't get that disclosure, but of course I was an investor. And I had no knowledge, I had no hard knowledge that someone had died in the house, nor did I go research to find out. Am I required?
There's no obligation to go spend 30 hours researching how somebody died in a property. If you knew, or if they said to you, somebody was murdered or somebody was shot.
Who's they? Neighbors?
Whoever the neighbors were that were telling you.
The nosy people.
The nosy people. Remember, now neighborhood, if somebody neighbor knowing that doesn't mean anything. Now, if they said there was a person that was murdered in the property, I would say to be safe, yes, you should investigate. And that, because you could argue that you have knowledge if some neighbors were around the property and those neighbors had been there a significant amount of time, they probably know the truth. Yes, I said probably, but it would be safer to do the investigation, in my opinion, and find out what the exact cause was. If it was a natural cause, then obviously you don't have to disclose it. If it was a murder that you find out, then I would disclose it. Yes, sir. Yeah, and that's the thing about deaths. I mean, the example I gave you guys earlier about the property I was working on with an agent, I just Googled the address and it came up. It's pretty easy, especially if somebody's murdered in a property, you're going to find it online. And if all it takes is somebody just Googling the address and it'll come up.
Suicide, is it?
Suicide does not have to be disclosed. Suicide does not have to be disclosed.
Okay, it's not.
Nope, not murder. Any other questions? Yes, ma'am.
I understand that the listing agent would be expected to, if somebody told them, but are you expecting the buyer's agent to know also if somebody died in the house?
No, because the obligation on the seller's disclosures is on the seller. So there's no obligation for a buyer's agent to go research the death and figure out what type of cause it was. Nah, you don't need to do that as a buyer's agent. Any other last minute questions? Yes, sir. Yeah, I left my cards out on there's some up here. I can give you my email address if you guys want to write it down, or you can pick up a card. My email is But you know what, I'll just go back to the... So my email's right here. This is my cell phone number if you need anything. I would put it on there for a reason. I mean, part of our obligation, I feel like, as title companies, and for me also a lawyer, is to be there for you guys, to keep you out of trouble. So if you ever need anything, you can, much to my wife's chagrin, call me 7 days a week. Most of the time, I mean, I do get calls at I usually stop answering after about midnight. So give me from like midnight to 5 to sleep, and then I'll call you back the next day. But please email me, call me, anytime we can talk about any subjects that you guys want to talk about. It's right up here, yes ma'am. I almost laser pointed at it because I was really liking this thing. It's right there.
Use it while you got it.
I know. Anybody else have any other questions while you guys are taking down the... Yes, sir. Yeah, okay, come on, let's go, cocaine. Hopefully that's not what you remember me guys for. I'm just kidding. Anybody else have any questions at all?
I need to see a contractor. I need a good realtor. I'm a good attorney.
Okay, well,
Yeah.
call me.
Call me. I'll call you 11:59 at night.
11:59, and most of the time I'll answer.